Hello and welcome to the first installment of How to Win, the Vandenberg Coalition's new series covering the challenges facing the Department of Defense and the U.S. military. Each episode dives deep into a different challenge faced by the Secretary of Defense and the President as it relates to the United States military. I'm excited to start today with the ultimate building block of all large organizations, people. Today we're going to be talking about recruiting, training, and personnel issues facing the military services and the Department of Defense as a whole. I'm excited to be joined by two excellent experts to discuss. Secretary Robert Wilkie served as the 10th Secretary of Veterans Affairs from 2018 to 2021. Prior to that, he served in the Department of Defense as the Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. Joining him, Lieutenant General Thomas Spoehr is a 36-year veteran of the United States Army, and since retiring has been a prolific commentator on defense issues, including recruitment and retention issues. With that, time to dive in. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So I wanted to start off, right at the beginning and right at the basics with recruiting. Of course, any big organization can't get anywhere without people to do their jobs. And General Spoehr, you've written a number of articles over the past few years about the ongoing military recruiting crisis. I think last year the numbers are that only the Marine Corps and the Space Force managed to hit their goals. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what the issue is and what's kind of causing the military to not be able to hit their goals.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sam, and thanks for having me again. So this defies kind of simplistic answers. This is what many people call a wicked problem, and so it has multiple causes, and it'll require multiple solutions, unfortunately. So recruiting has always kind of been a close numbers kind of thing, even though 4 million young people turn 18 every year, and the military only needs a couple of 100,000 at most. It struggles almost every year to make those numbers. And so this has been the accumulation of factors which has pushed military recruiting into the red zone, if you will. And so a really good economy with a low unemployment rate doesn't help things. A record number of Americans who do not qualify for military service. And then there are a number of other factors. So declining veterans in our populations, fewer and fewer veterans who can tell their nieces and nephews and sons and daughters about military service. And then there is other factors like a loss of confidence by the U.S. in the U.S. military. And so all these things are combining to push recruiting into an area which they have not found themselves in before. They have had years where they missed recruiting targets, and then the following year they came back. It was a one-time kind of one-off thing. Now I have written that I think military recruiting is entering a period of a long drought or a famine, if you will, where unless we change the environment and the circumstances, it's not going to rebound very easily.
And like I mentioned, it starts with people and everything's downstream from there. Secretary Wilkie, could you give us a little bit of an idea of what are the kind of compounding problems that happen when you have 1 year or maybe 2 or 3 where you aren't able to hit your goals?
So it's like not having the Congress pass a budget. You can't project what you need in the coming years. But I want to pick up on something that General mentioned, and that is the other side of the recruiting issue. You're right. These are the lowest recruiting numbers since Creighton Abrams devised the all-volunteer force in 1973. But I think there's a much deeper problem. The General mentioned the percentage of Americans who are even qualified for military service. This is a problem that goes back all the way to kindergarten in this country, where we discourage things like physical activity. A very small percentage of Americans can even pass the basic physical fitness test for the military. Entire swaths of our country have completely checked out of military service. We are now reduced to about 11 to 12, maybe 13 states, stretching from Virginia to Texas and Oklahoma, that provide the bulk of those coming into the military. General Mattis used to tell me that he only needed one recruiting station on the entire West Coast, and that was in South Central Los Angeles, and one recruiting station in New England, in South Boston. So when people are not physically prepared, but more importantly, when they're not culturally prepared, when they are not taught American history, when they are not taught a sense of public service and public duty, an obligation to do something for the greater good of the country. That begins a snowball effect that the military sees downstream. And I think the cultural problems are going to be problematic for the military for as far as we can see into the future. Another area of this is being more creative. The military still works in an industrial age way. Number to a billet, person has to look this way. Well, the reason the Space Force is thriving is because of its name and its potential. But even there, we should take the talent in places like Silicon Valley, Route 128 in Boston, Austin, Texas in their technology sector, and say, look, if you want to join the military and have a lot of fun and unleash the power of those centers of technological excellence on the world, you don't have to crawl through the mud. We can create a reserve corps just for people like you. I mean, the People's Liberation Army has 2 entire divisions that's focused on nothing but trying to take out the Pentagon's electric systems or computer systems. We have that latent power, but we have to use it, and we have to be more creative.
General Spoehr, any thoughts from you on the downstream effects of recruiting crisis?
Yeah, and so there's a pyramid, if you will, in the military where the generals are at the top and the lower, the sailors and the airmen and the soldiers are at the bottom. And the military needs vast quantities of young, physically fit Americans at the lower levels, the privates, if you will, the airmen. And so when we have a year when the military misses their recruiting goals, there's a gap in that pyramid which goes on forever. You can't all of a sudden, hurry up and catch up the next year type of thing. You can try, but it's rarely successful. And so this gap we have now in privates will translate it all the way through the years into shortages of non-commissioned officers and the officer targets as well. The lieutenants will be short majors and things like that. And so we will be dealing with what looks like a 1 year or 2 year or 3 year problem now for the next 20 years as our military suffers this gap in its people. And I read an article the other day that the Navy is short 22,000 at-sea billets. Okay, think about that. 22,000 sailors.
A lot of ships.
I know. 22,000 sailors are missing from ships. And I know our ships are wonderful and automated and push button, but you need people to put the missiles in the right places and things like that. And so that translates to a real loss of combat capability, 22,000 sailors missing from ships. And then you also see reports of sailors, soldiers, everybody stressed. Their anxiety levels are off the charts right now. And one of the reasons is that they're doing the work of 2 or 3 other people. And so this has got real consequences, especially when our Navy is in the Red Sea right now, trying to defeat a Houthi threat, and we're short sailors at the places where you actually need them.
Secretary Wilkie, before you were Secretary of Veterans Affairs, you were Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, and I think a lot of the conversation about recruiting as a problem, it often focuses on the uniform side and the service side. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a picture of what does that look like from the civilian leadership side within the Pentagon? How did you approach this sort of problem when you were in that seat, and how have your successors come after this sort of problem?
Well, the most important thing I found, and I carried this over into VA, was that I surrounded myself at my office with people who had served, people who either had been in uniform or came from military families. And why is that important? This is a culture unlike any other. It has a unique set of values. It has a distinct language. And in terms of filling the ranks, you don't need academics or people who have never been around the world who look at people like General Spoehr as they would look at a pin on a map at some Princeton debating society. And by having that kind of structure, and it started with General Mattis, we were able to go to the country and say, look, we're going to want you to come. We're going to give you every tool to be ready to fight, but also we're going to do everything we can to make that fight short and get you home. I don't think you have that kind of awareness today. Example, Secretary of Army, and the Constitution, the statutes are quiet on what the qualifications are for these positions. The president wants, you can, as long as you get through the Senate. But we have a Secretary of the Army now who says she doesn't want second and third generation recruits. Well, she doesn't even know the composition of her own service. 79% of all soldiers come from military or Army families. And they take these roles as political as opposed to military. She also says that we're going to throw out the physical readiness standards that we put in place that were designed to fit the combat category that the individual soldier was in. For instance, the billet that needed the most brute physical strength was the field artillery, because you're carrying around hundreds of pounds of ordnance. You didn't really need that for the finance corps. They threw all those out and reduced fitness to a level that 60 and 70-year-old Americans could pass. 10 sit-ups and 2 miles in 25 minutes. Well, the average American walks a mile in 12 minutes because they think anything that is tougher wars against equity, for whatever that means. The intractable demands of combat, of service, dictate that those in power have to do everything they can to ensure that the force is most physically fit. And this is not new. As General knows, the greatest exemplar of putting those standards in place was George Marshall, who was plucked from way down on the list of general officers by Franklin Roosevelt in the year and a half before Pearl Harbor. And Roosevelt said, go in there and fix it. He fired friends, general officers, dozens, who didn't live up to the expectations and the standards that he'd set. I have no problem wondering whether or not young people can meet the standards, as long as we set the standards high and as long as we enunciate a clear mission. One last thing, and I do think this has contributed to the latest drop in recruiting. People see the images of Kabul. In the average American's mind, that was an operation where the young soldiers and Marines and sailors were left out to dry, that there was no forethought put into that operation. I mean, I've argued that an ROTC student could have planned that thing better. And they see that and they question whether or not they want their children to be put in that position. So it's a number of factors, but you have to set the standards that not only prepare Americans for the fight, but standards that ensure that they will come home and that they have every tool, both physical, mental, and material, available to carry on that fight.
It's very much a question of, the image and the story that you're selling to potential recruits. And it, as you mentioned, General, it's a thorny problem with a lot of facets. Are there any other specific policy areas or changes you would recommend to help get at this problem?
Yeah, I could go on this, and I like to break the recruiting challenge into 3 areas. There's structural. How do you actually recruit? where are your recruiters? Who are they? Are they professional recruiters or amateur recruiters? That's structural. Then there's the occupational factors. How much are you paying new people? What kind of bonuses? What will you give me to sign up? How long is my commitment? Where will I go? Can I enlist with a buddy and we both go somewhere? And then finally, there's the more esoterical propensity. How do I get people to want to join? That type of thing. And so there is room for progress in all three of these areas here. The services, if you will, the Army, Navy, Air Force, et cetera, they're working very hard on the structural part. How many recruiters do we have? What are the courses? What are the qualifications? They're doing everything they can. The Navy just waived the requirement for a high school degree, for example, trying to get more people eligible. Then there's the occupational, the pay, the benefits. They've increased a lot of bonuses to $50,000. That's not pulling people in for some reason. And so Congress tried to look at pay rates and try and make them more competitive this last Congress, and that did not succeed. I think there's more room to be done in paying young people more. I did an analysis that says you can, high school graduate, you can go and make more at an Amazon warehouse and get about $18 an hour, and that you won't get that as an Army private. And so you're getting paid less than an Amazon warehouse, and that person goes home at 5 o'clock and nobody calls them in the middle of the night to ask for anything else until they get there the next day. And then finally, this idea about how do you get people to want to join the military. That's the hardest part. And if you get 100 people together, you'll get 100 different opinions about how do you get people to want to join. It starts, as Secretary Wilkie said, a civic education. People need to understand what the concept is of service to your nation. What are the three branches of government? Many Americans can't even tell you that. And what is this idea of service to a nation? And I'll just tackle one other thing. There's this myth that if you join the military, you're going to come back broken. I'm going to come back either physically or mentally broken. I hear this over and over again. And yes, tragically that occurs, but the overwhelming majority of people come back after having served in the military stronger, better, smarter, and more employable citizens back to their communities who volunteer and vote at a rate that surpasses their contemporaries. And so this idea that you're going to, and popular media doesn't help there. There are commercials you can see on TV where people are missing limbs and they've been tragically injured, which kind of perpetuate that idea. And yes, that happens, but it's the rare minority. Most people come back stronger.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time talking to parents of new recruits. In fact, I'm going to do another mass swearing-in ceremony down in Fayetteville, North Carolina in May. And one of the things I tell them is that your young people will make more life-altering decisions by the time they're 23 or 24 than the average American will make in a lifetime. Your young people will be able to go into a future employer, look that person straight in the eyes, put out a hand, and have a very deep and meaningful conversation about life and obstacles and overcoming and achieving than their counterparts that they went to high school with. But the general hit on something that's very, very relevant, and that's why I keep going back to culture. We have one segment of American society who look at anyone in the military, they look at two ways. One, as the general said, as victims, and the other as people who couldn't make it in the outside world. Tell that to Dwight Eisenhower, or Omar Bradley, or Jimmy Carter. And I use Harvard as an example because they're easy to pick on. If you go to the Harvard does actually have a chapel. If you go to that chapel and you look on one side of the wall and you see tablet after tablet with the names of Harvard men who died in every war leading up to Korea, and there's nothing after that. That goes back to what I said about whole swaths of society opting out of military service, that's something that others do. And I hear it all the time. Look, my military experience in uniform pales in comparison to the generals or my father's. I mean, my father was an incredibly decorated combat soldier. And I go places where I'm told, thank you for your service, by people whom I think they're trying to say something polite, but what some of them really mean is, thank you for your service so my child can go to graduate school. And that is now compounded by something that you have talked about. And that's looking at the military now as just another jobs program, instead of a profession of arms that brings together not only physical and mental fitness, but an understanding of history, tradition, sacrifice, taking care of someone else that you find in no other walk of life, except maybe the chaplaincy or the medical profession. And we don't convey that. And my fear is that we have so many sections of this country that have checked out that it becomes easy to deploy people on missions that may not, adventures that may not be in the best interest of the United States, but they look good in a Princeton debating society because they've never had a feel for that. And I'll make one partisan comment. The national security establishment of this administration, this national security advisor, the Secretary of State, never been around a uniform. They don't know the intractable demands that being in that uniform makes on an young American. And I think those are the kinds of things that the average American sees. And that's another reason why we have these troughs. Last thing, it doesn't have to be that way. I, as a youngster, remember the aftermath of Vietnam when my own father would have to arm himself to go in the barracks in the 82nd Airborne Division. Elite troops, because the Army had imploded on itself. After Vietnam, we had leadership that really didn't know which way an end was up in terms of leadership at the White House. But there was a new wave that came in with Reagan, preaching love of country. America is a special place. Please come and join us and help restore American pride. Now that sounds sophomoric to the enlightened. But what did we have during an economic boom in the 1980s? We didn't have to worry about recruiting. We were turning people away. So the trends can be turned around, but this time I think they're a little more complex than they were in the 70s and 80s.
And a little more entrenched maybe after several decades of that trajectory. I'd like to turn now to kind of look within the Pentagon and within the military. General, could you give us a bit of an introduction to the problems of training folks once we get them in the door through the recruiting pipeline? What are the challenges related to training them, getting them into their jobs, and how would you say the military is doing with that today?
Yeah, great question. And so the military does many things, but one of the things they excel on is taking young Americans and making them into military people. I mean, they are used to taking people with all kinds of different backgrounds, various levels of physical fitness from anywhere. As long as they have a basic proficiency in English, the military does pretty well in turning them into. They're used to just a broad funnel of people coming in, and they relate to them, and they transform them into American fighting men and women. So they do very well in that. They have to meet some standards, though. I mean, so people want to know, well, why can't you take people that are obese? And the reason is really for the protection of the person. If a person comes in, with a body fat of, 30% or something like that, there's an excellent chance they're going to injure themselves. They're going to break a limb. They're going to have a stress fracture or something even worse than that. And so they have to at least be within a certain boundary of body fat percentage before they take them in. But, I have no worries about People, again, I talk to young people a lot too, and they like, well, I could never hack it in the military. It's just, I've seen the movies, I've seen Zero Dark 30, I can't do that. And I say, where did you get this impression? I mean, the military thrives on taking people and making them into the best versions of themselves, and so as long as you don't give up, the military's not going to give up on you. They've invested so much to get you into the door that they're going to do everything they can to make you succeed. So only if you stop trying will they stop trying. And so I have no concerns about once we get somebody in the door, assuming they meet the basic standards, that they'll be okay. Now, there is another thing I just need to mention, and that is, and I don't understand the causes of it, but youth mental health is a growing issue. I saw a statistic that some 19% of our 18 to 24-year-olds have been seen by a medical professional for some reason of mental health. And that is a growing problem. And what's connected with that is also the prescription of drugs to work on that.
And I know that causes a lot of problems with, disqualifying people, trying to get them who are interested in joining the military, but it's in many ways an automatic disqualification for certain things.
It is, and you have to have not had used or been prescribed the drug like within something.
Sure.
I think it's 2 years or something like that. So if you had a problem when you were 12, you got, let's say, Adderall, and by 16 that had been resolved, that's not an issue. It's if you come in and you are still on these prescription medications, that is a problem. And I think for obvious reasons, military service is a stressful thing. And so you would not want to take somebody that is already predisposed to mental illness and now put them on the deck of a destroyer that's sailing in the Red Sea, where you're away from family, you're away from all your support mechanisms, and there's somebody trying to kill you.
Yeah, I want to build on that. And I talk about this quite a bit, particularly in response to the DE&I drive. And I'm not going to get into any particulars on that. But the DE&I drive is at war with the fundamental precepts of the armed forces of the United States, the ethic of those armed forces. Why? The military, as the general hinted, is the great leveler in society. It doesn't matter where you come from, what you look like. If you perform, you're accepted. The only other part of American society that operates like that on a daily basis is professional athletics. I'll give you an example. The Deep South, when I was a youngster, Fort Bragg, the 82nd Airborne Division, the most decorated of all Army divisions, the Guard of Honor, America's Guard. Every Thursday, my father was actually at home at 6 a.m. He wasn't at his headquarters at 2 a.m. because he was going to a commander's conference. His driver happened to be an African-American sergeant named Johnson. But he was driving him, and this is the mid-1970s, to the commanding general's conference room, who also happened to be an African-American. The Army, the Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps was so far ahead of the United States in bringing together, as the general said, people of all backgrounds. And that is something that makes it, as I mentioned, the leveler. But if we inject DEI concepts into this, let's just use physical fitness. I mentioned what you can do now to pass the Army's, just pass it, physical fitness. What does that do? If you have a squad of 10 field artillerymen coming out of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and 2 of those gunners are just monsters. I mean, these guys can lift anything. But the other 8 have only passed at the minimum standard. What does that do to those 2? They're doing the job of 8 others. This is a symbiotic equation. And it's only as good, and I hate to use cliches, it's only as good as the weakest link, which is why, and the generals talked about it, and I've talked about it, and of course the great exemplar, as I mentioned, was George C. Marshall. Those tough physical fitness standards are evident. Now, let me just knock down a notion that seems to be prevalent on Capitol Hill, particularly with those who have never served, that somehow the fights of the future will look like Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock, where they press a button and a laser goes out. Let's talk about what's happening in Ukraine right now. The month of February, the Russians lost 29,000 dead. In Vietnam, we lost 56,000 dead in 10 years. They lost half of that in 1 month. No matter what the scientists say, no matter what the politicians like to believe, troops still have to fly the planes, man the ships, and hold and take and hold ground. And that puts incredible emphasis on the mental and the physical. And if we don't do that, and we've seen this in American history, there are great examples. The two most famous, Kasserine Pass in 1942, our first encounter with Rommel and the Afrika Korps, where our troops were not in shape, they were not trained, and the casualties were enormous. The second being something called Task Force Smith, when we responded to the North Korean invasion of the South in 1950, and our troops had been a garrison force. General Ridgway said the physical fitness standards were appalling, and we barely held on until troops from the United States and the UK came later. We can't afford that any longer because we have a three-headed monster out there. Fourth, if you want to include North Korea, all designed because they tell us they want to get rid of us. So that puts a premium on those things that have made the U.S. military successful.
Yeah, General, I wonder if I could, get your thoughts on this as well. Secretary Wilkie mentioned Ukraine, but we're seeing, both in Ukraine and in Israel, a lot of people have talked about it as the return of kind of large-scale warfare for the first time in 25, 30 years. Israel, it's a, very small but highly professional military, fights a lot like the United States in many ways. Ukraine, a post-Soviet military, but one that has, 10 years fighting, insurgency and separatists in the East, and now 2 years fighting a large-scale war, but a post-Soviet military that's trying to become more like our military, more like NATO militaries in terms of technology and training and doctrine. Looking at these two conflicts and the things that, the novel things that we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years, what lessons would you draw for how we should be changing our kind of training and our preparation of our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines?
Yeah, thanks for that. And, I'll echo Secretary Wilkie. A lot of people believe that future wars will be, clean and painless and that type of thing. What we're learning is that yes, we need to bring the new stuff in the military, the cyber, the drones, the long range, the robots. All that has a place in the future military, but it is not replacing. It is additive to what we see that has combated, that has gone on forever, is that there's going to be the need for Marines and soldiers and sailors and airmen to be eye to eye and in the close fight with the enemy. And so tank battles, infantry assaults, all that type of thing
People compare Ukraine to World War I with trenches on the front line.
Yeah, and so as far as we have come, we are still in that kind of situation, and I don't see an end to that. Robots, if you ever been around Christmas and when a child gets a robot-controlled car, it immediately gets stuck under the couch or something like that. That still happens, and terrain in places is much more complicated than your living room, and so robots just don't work well in modern combat where there's things to get to hold them up. And so we're going to have this need for a military that can do the combat tasks as well as the high-end cyber, space, you name it types of things, which so people say, why do we need such physically fit people? And why can't we compromise on the standards? This person may only be behind a desk. Well, even a person, let's presume there's a person behind a desk, if they are physically unfit, they can't go maybe 3 days without sleeping or things like that. So physical fitness is not just about picking up artillery rounds. It's the endurance and the resilience to hang in there, because there is no, in the military, there's no night shift and day shift that comes in. You know, the day shift doesn't says, okay, you got this, I'm gone. It's, you're in it until it's over kind of thing. And so we still have this need for physically fit and people that are resilient in the U.S. military.
It sounds very much, both of you are, talking about a back to basics, kind of really emphasis on
back to the bayonet.
Back to the bayonet. That was what I was going to ask. Is I've heard you, I've heard you use that phrase before. Can you tell us, what you mean by that and elaborate a little bit?
Well, it refers to training and fitness standards that prepare one for the combat specialty that the individual's in. I'm an intelligence officer by training. I'm not going to be at Coronado learning how to be a SEAL, or at Fort Benning, or what do they call it now? I don't know what they call Fort Benning now.
Oh, Ranger, or Fort Moore.
Fort Moore.
Yeah.
What great soldier. I'm not going to be there in Ranger training, but I will be prepared for an intelligence position, and that may require me to leave the operations center. But for those who are in those schools, it means the highest physical standards and training that reflects what they will encounter. There are no timeout cards in places like Ukraine. I mean, we went through that in the military, I guess 20-something years ago, where recruits were handing their drill sergeants little cards saying, "I'm stressed." That doesn't happen in the real world. And as the general points out, the young people are very resilient once you get them into that pipeline where they know that their lives depend on what their buddy does. The buddy knows that his life depends on what his friend does. But if you don't prepare them, if you don't challenge them to meet those physical standards and mental standards, then you repeat Task Force Smith, Kasserine Pass, and the potential for disaster is very high. General mentioned there are things in warfare that have not changed. Napoleon, Washington, Grant would understand exactly why soldiers are trained to take and hold land, why artillerymen are trained the way they are, because the tail end, the consequences of battle have not changed. The toll that it takes has not changed. Scales may have changed. The scale of combat may have changed. The weapons are a little different, although they would certainly know artillery and cavalry. But that's why you can't water down standards to fit some social justice model of what you believe the military should be, because this is not a fair world. Nobody on the other side is going to give you a timeout card. And as General pointed out, we have seen the return of basic warfare. And right now, the Pentagon should be in the process of preparing itself for the return of great power conflict, force on force, not chasing guys in the desert, but as he said, combined arms operation, tanks, artillery, air, infantry. And we'd better wake up.
Can I piggyback
Please
on something?
do, yeah.
And lots of times I'll talk to audience and they don't really know how the military functions. So they say, well, what's the impact? Let's say we had 100 people in an Army company. And let's say one or two are not physically fit, or one or two are not they have a mental issue or something like that. They've got 98 other people there to take care of them. How big a deal can that be? And they don't understand that many of the roles in the military are so specialized that success or failure depends on one person's actions, that type of thing. And so I remember reading an account of Cop Keating, a horrible battle in Afghanistan where a little fire base was under attack, and it was only a platoon or company-sized element, I want to say. One of the people couldn't perform. They went into the fetal position and that type of thing. And he was the person responsible for providing ammunition to one of the key places. And so if only one person is not able to do their job, that can have cascading effects on the entire thing. And similarly on a ship or in an Air Force squadron, if one person, a key person, isn't there when they are needed to do their thing, that can roll up into a failure for the entire unit. So yes, failure can depend on the ability of one or two people to do their jobs in a small unit.
I mean, that's the old Napoleon dictum. Men are nothing, but a man is everything. And that's what the general was pointing out. Because back to the example that I used, if those two physically fit and powerful gunners have to carry the load for the 8 other people on that weapon who can't lift and who can't move the pieces on the tube that need to be moved to fire that weapon, the whole enterprise breaks down. And that has a cascading effect down the line.
In many ways, it sounds like a reciprocal problem with what we started out with, where if you set a high standard and you train people to a high standard with very clear goals and tasks, they'll rise to meet that. And then, I think as you mentioned, Secretary Wilkie, when they get out on the back end, they'll be better for it. And as you mentioned, General, and that'll help bring more people into the pipeline. And it's very much, a holistic system. And you have to kind of, if one thing breaks, things start to cascade in more ways than one.
Yeah, I got an example of that. So
Please.
The Navy is missing their recruiting goals. For the first quarter of this fiscal year, they were 7,000 sailors short. Well, one of the reasons they cited for that is that they're only at 80% strength in their recruiters. And so this is a perpetuating problem. They're short recruiters because they don't have enough sailors in their fleet to keep the ships going.
And pull recruiters out to fill 22,000 billets at sea.
Exactly. And so the more people your service is short, the harder it is to get trained recruiters into the field. And it's, I hate to use the word, but it's a death spiral. And that's kind of what's occurring in many places.
The Marine Corps does it well. I mean, you've got people like Jim Mattis who spent 3 years as a recruiter. They all do. But this points to another problem. And this is something that the new Pentagon leadership can correct. And look at the United States Air Force. All we hear about is pilot shortages. We don't have a pilot shortage. We have a bureaucratic pipeline problem. For instance, the Air Force decided many years ago that it wasn't glamorous for Air Force pilots to command training squadrons. Everybody wanted to command the 4th Fighter Wing at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base because that was Chuck Yeager's command. And that's a worthy goal, follow in Chuck Yeager's footsteps. But in the meantime, down in San Angelo, Texas, where the pilots are coming through, or Lackland, or Shepherd Air Force Base, or Altus, they don't have enough training squadrons to meet the needs of all these young people who want to be pilots. I can tell you, I've seen pilots, young people. One young man's goal was to fly C-5As in the same squadron that his father flew. Top graduate of ROTC, private pilot's license, had to wait 2 years to get a training billet. That's on big bureaucracy, big Air Force for that.
Nobody joins the Air Force to sit around waiting to fly planes.
No. And of course, now we have a Pentagon that says, oh, because you have a private pilot's license and you've shown that this is what you want to do in life, we're not going to give you an advantage because that's at war with diversity. That's not me. That's the current Secretary of the Air Force and the current Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So they've removed that. I would think you would want people to be mentally prepared if you can get them into that position.
And to show a
And to
focus
be-
and a drive.
Yes,
and,
this is
yeah.
what I want. And that's how the social politics now enters into this and impacts everything downstream. And remember what I believe, because I saw it, the military, by its very nature, does not distinguish based on your skin color or your religion or where you come from in the United States. If you perform, you're accepted. Unlike, as I said, any other segment of American society, perhaps with the exception of professional sport.
Yeah, in many ways, it's one of the few institutions left in the United States that still shapes people to be a particular type of person, rather than the people shaping the institution that they're part of. And that's a good place to transition to our next subject. I wanted to talk with both of you about kind of the public perception of the military and the danger of politicization of the military. I know you've both kind of written and spoken about this in the past, but to start, General Spoehr, several years ago, right after the Biden administration came into office, there was a push to tackle alleged, right-wing extremism in the military. And at the time, or a little after, I believe you wrote and called it a solution in search of a problem.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is especially in the aftermath of January the 6th, there was this perception that many of the people involved with that were veterans. And I think there might have even been one or two people that were actually on active duty. And so Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, stood up a countering extremism task force and ordered a one-day stand down for the entire Department of Defense, which cost an extraordinary amount of time and money, only to find out later, Rand did a survey, that the number of extremists in the U.S. military is roughly on par with the U.S. population. So they're, unless you want to stand down the entire United States and re-indoctrinate the United States, the military does not have a problem per se of extremism. Sure.
Let me give you the figures.
Yeah.
They found 100 potential. I went back and looked at the courts martial for since 2012. Do you know how many soldiers have been convicted in courts martial of political extremism in the armed forces of the United States? One. Since 2012. Going back to, again, my youth, you could have found 100 extremists in one barracks at Fort Bragg in the 1970s. You had biker gangs, you had drug gangs, you had Black Panthers, the fruit of Islam in its most virulent form in the 70s, because the whole structure had collapsed. Again, not knowing what it's like to be in barracks, not knowing what it's like to stand in ranks, if you are that extremist, you're not going to make it. You will be pushed out by those who have to survive, and they're going to survive without you causing those problems. They will tell the command. The command will know. So the general, when he wrote that, was absolutely right. It was an extremist solution looking for an extremist problem that did not exist, because that kind of individual fights against the very essence of what it means to be a military community.
So building on, on that, there's a danger in the future that, we have a Democratic president now, and at the moment, a lot of Republicans feel like, the military is being tampered with in one way, and if that situation switches politically, there's a danger of, reversing to the other, the other tack of a lot of Democrats thinking, the military is out of step with them and is being tampered with by, a Republican administration. And, really one of the great things historically has been, the military being an American institution. It's not a partisan institution like it has been in many other countries. So I wonder if both of you could speak a little bit to, how do we restore that balance where, both sides of the political aisle can feel like the military is something that has to do, is something that I can see myself represented in. I don't feel like it's on the other side of the scales.
Yeah, the U.S. military has to stay apolitical. They cannot have a political mind of its own, and they run the risk of people on the left viewing the military as a bunch of extremists, right-wing nuts, to the people on the right viewing it as a bunch of socially justice warriors, and neither is the right place for the military to be. And that it starts with, so I need to make a distinction. This Secretary of Defense, the secretaries of the military services, are by their very nature political appointees. And so they are there to implement the agenda of the president and ensure that. So I understand when a political appointee has a political agenda, but where I become very concerned is where I see that kind of echoed and by the military uniformed leaders who are there to kind of represent the interests of the military. And then most of them do exactly the right thing, but there are some cases where I think a uniformed leader tends to confuse their role from that of their political masters and starts to enter into areas which are not helpful, and that is support areas which do not support the readiness of the armed forces, but support some other agenda.
Do you have an example in mind you could give us?
Secretary Wilkie mentioned the former chief of staff of the Air Force expressing, we have too many white pilots and we need to change that.
Current chairman of the Joint Chiefs.
We needed more pilots. And frankly, if they meet if we meet the standard, they're good pilots, the best pilots, we ought not to care really what they look like in any way, shape, or form. And so ideas like that, and it's more than just that, it's the perception that created throughout America when they're actually prioritizing some other group other than yourself.
Put it in writing.
Yeah.
I have the memo. Let me add to that. I'm very old-fashioned when it comes to politics in the military. I was lucky to be around an officer corps who had men, they were all men at that time, who admired Dwight Eisenhower and George Marshall. Most of the people I grew up around didn't even vote. Not because they were shirking their duty to the greater public and to the nation, but they believed any public expression, even voting, wars against the apolitical nature of the military.
I believe that's another George Marshall example.
Marshall didn't vote. Eisenhower didn't vote.
I didn't vote until 4 years ago for the first time in my life.
And I remember being very angry, and my Republican friends get upset with me when I see letters signed by hundreds and hundreds of retired generals making hard political points. Harry Truman used to say, I don't mind generals getting involved in politics, but let them get involved in politics like everybody else and go through the system. Of course, he had been dealing with General MacArthur. And we've been lucky in our history that we haven't had too many political leaders in uniform. I mean, you can go back to people like, Custer, McClellan, MacArthur, but those people were few and far between. But the public has to know, and this is a broader issue, not just for the military. When I see civil servants protesting the policies of the President of the United States, walking out of their offices, we've reached a very dangerous inflection point in this country. Forget Republican and Democrat. The civil service, just like the military, is set up to be apolitical. Give you one historic example as to how this tradition started. It goes back to General Washington, two scenes in his life. After Cornwallis is defeated, Washington takes the army back up to New York to watch, I think it was General Clinton, Henry Clinton, who was still in New York with the bulk of the British Army, and Washington's just watching it. Right outside of present-day West Point is where his headquarters are. And Alexander Hamilton comes running to him that the officers, all the officers were in this massive barn, I think it's still there, planning to march on Congress demand that Congress give them special status and back pay, or else they were going to put one of their own in charge. Well, Washington hears this, and he goes storming into that meeting and takes it over and says no. And he goes through the list of what they were fighting for. The most dramatic point was he wants to read a letter that he was writing Congress to urge Congress to do right by the military. And he can't read it. And he pulls out his spectacles and he says, "Gentlemen, forgive me, for my hair has grown white and my eyes have grown tired in the service of my country." And there's not a dry eye in the place. He walks off. A year later, Washington again makes a public procession from New York down to Annapolis, Maryland. He goes into the Congress in uniform, takes his commission as commander-in-chief out of his pocket, hands it to the Congress, and say, "I retire to public life." Now that's very dramatic, but because of those standards set by General Washington and the nature of the American body politic and our system, we've always prized that apolitical military. It has to be. And I'll just use, you asked the general for an example. I'll use another one. This general is now gone, but it's unfathomable that a George Marshall or Bradley would have been in front of Congress opining on social justice issues. And I'm pointing to, I won't even name him, who was talking about combating the rage out there and setting up this social justice agenda. That's not his job. His job is to organize, train, and equip. His job is not to be an adjunct to the political views of the prevailing administration, and that goes equally to Republicans. And last thing, I get upset, and this is for both parties, when I see presidents making speeches and he's on a military base and they dutifully line up all the soldiers behind him. And I don't even like that. President should be speaking to the troops, yes, but not using them as a prop. And that's a bipartisan criticism, and it's probably just a minor point in all of this, but I'm old-fashioned.
Well, I have one final question for both of you, and by way of introduction, it's one of the main themes of this series is, with an eye towards the 2024 election and a possible new president, secretary of defense in January 2025. If each of you are advising, say, the incoming secretary of defense on the challenges we've been talking about today, what's the number one challenge that you would want to see tackled here, and what are one or two of the policy recommendations you would make to that end?
The Secretary of Defense, he or she, needs to get out in front of the American people, be a spokesperson for the American military and for service in the military. And I'll even say service in other forms as well, if you want to serve as a teacher or something like that. But it's been too long that I have heard an American leader talk about the virtue of service to your country. I've not heard it, and I don't know how long, at least 10 years probably, that this has been discussed as a need. That's at least something. I mean, right now, there's silence. And so all they're hearing are people saying, I got this great job in Silicon Valley, or I got this job in Amazon or something like that. There's nothing pointing them in the other direction. They maybe get that from their parents or maybe not. They have to be a spokesperson. And our secretaries of defense have not been very vocal. I'm sure they're doing a wonderful job inside the Pentagon, but I don't see them much outside the Pentagon talking on that topic. And then the other thing I would look at is this figuring out what young people value and delivering that to people that that volunteer for service. Maybe it's pay, maybe it's vacation. I don't know what it is exactly, but we have to figure out what it is young people value and make sure that's part of our compensation package to join the military.
Yeah, I'm going to build on that. I think that the next Secretary of Defense has to go to the country, not in a political way, but in a civic way, and talk about the profession of the armed forces, what it means to serve, why is it valuable, not only for the defense of freedom, but also for that young American's future. The other thing that the Secretary of Defense will have to say, if this is not already done by the new president, is to tell the American people and the Congress what we must prepare for. Since 2001, actually a little before that, the American people have now been conditioned that the enemies of the world run around sand dunes in flowing robes. The next Secretary of Defense has to prepare not only the people in the Congress by telling the truth, but also reorient the armed forces of the United States to that traditional notion of great power conflict. But nothing happens unless society begins to change, that we start teaching our young people that this, I don't mean to be melodramatic or sophomoric, I'll quote Harry Truman. Truman said, we have to tell our young people that the United States is the only nation in the history of the world that has offered a helping hand to all the peoples of the world, including our enemies. That is something worth uplifting. That is something worth fighting for, that we are the last best hope. But we have to start as a society in kindergarten, in elementary school, in high school, not just with civics and history, but also with physical fitness. Last example. I, as Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, would go to big cities and beg them, look, I'll put junior ROTC into your high schools. Many of these big cities have kicked junior ROTC out. They're depriving young people of an opportunity to think what a better future would be for them. And I think we have to be more vigorous in sending that message and getting the message out to parents. Those are the things I think the next Secretary of Defense should do, because if you don't have that spirit, if you don't have that sense of purpose, then nothing else will work.
Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you all for watching.